Why are we all here today? We're here together because we have envisioned a future where our children and future generations can thrive in a cleaner, safer, and more just world. A world where we don't have to choose between economic development and saving the planet. A world where everyone knows that these two concepts must go hand in hand. We're here because we understand that working towards a cleaner and healthier environment is not only ethically sound, but equally important, it is also economically sensible for the world. A world where climate change is not a partisan issue, and where all countries work together, setting aside border boundaries, political differences, or even religious beliefs. Working together in order to embrace a truly sustainable and more competitive global economy. In the last days of President Obama's presidency, it was actually the 10th of January of 2017, he went back to Chicago, a city where he had started as a community organizer working with poor and underprivileged communities. He was there to give his final speech as president. And while I was sitting on the couch listening to his words on my TV screen with my two children, I remember feeling anxious about the future. And you know, there was something President Obama said that day which is still imprinted on my mind to this very day. He said, "Our democracy needs you, not just when there's an election, not just when your own narrow interest is at stake, but over the full span of a lifetime. If you're tired of arguing with strangers on the internet, try to talk with one of them in real life. If something needs fixing, lace up your shoes and do some organizing. If you're disappointed by your elected officials, grab a clipboard, get some signatures, and run for office yourself. Show up, dive in, persevere." I believe this is exactly why we're here today. You know that there's a lot of work to be done, and you want to take action. You got up, you showed up here in Cordoba today, and you're all here ready to be the drivers of the green economy in Argentina. And I'll tell you what, if there's one person here today who understands the power of what happens when ordinary, committed people come together and mobilize, that's President Obama. Because when we do, the greatest and most challenging issues are finally solved. Because if you persevere, like President Obama said in his last speech, you will eventually break open. You will find a path to progress. And a future where green technology and innovation come together to make this an increasingly competitive and more sustainable country. This is why we're here today, in this room, at this moment in history in Argentina. We're here because we're ready to take action, organize, and work hard to make a difference. And yes, why not? To make a breakthrough and change this country and change the world. So it is with great pleasure that I present to you a passionate climate change activist, someone who has shown all of us what it means to fulfill your civic duty and turn words into action, and most importantly, action into change. My former boss, my friend, ladies and gentlemen, the 44th President of the United States, Barak Obama!
Cordoba. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Oh, love you back. Thank you so much. Thank you, Juan, for that excellent introduction. I want to thank Alejandro Spinello and everybody at ALF for putting the summit together. I want to thank your governor, Juan Schiaretti, for his leadership on some of the most important issues, not just in this region, but throughout Argentina. I am thrilled to be back in Argentina. Last year, some of you know, I had the privilege of visiting Buenos Aires, and I was able to go to the Metropolitan Cathedral and El Parque de la Memoria. I was able to take my daughters to see the beauty of Bariloche. You saw I was dancing the tango, not very well. I ate a lot of good steak. In fact, Argentina may be the only country that eats more meat than the United States, which is difficult for us to admit because we have cowboys, but I know you have gauchos. So I've said before that I'm impressed with the work that's being done in Argentina. I think President Macri's initiated efforts to reconnect this country with the world community and to lay the groundwork for more sustainable and inclusive economic growth. And it is absolutely vital for Argentina to maintain and enhance its leadership role, not just in the region, but on the world stage. Because we're going to have to be partners to solve some of the most pressing problems that we face. We have many issues that are affecting all countries, not just some. Globalization and automation have brought us great wealth and opportunity and amazing new products, but are also increasing economic inequality that is creating destabilizing politics in many parts of the world. We continue to have threats of terrorism and failed states that result in mass migration. These are all issues that can't be solved by one nation alone. We have to solve them collectively. There's one issue that will, I believe, define the contours of this century more dramatically than any other, and that is the urgent threat of a changing climate. This is no longer speculation. This is no longer a distant problem that we can put off. This is an issue that's firmly in the present. The 15 warmest years on record have occurred in the last 17 years. 2015 was the warmest on record until 2016. 2016 was even warmer, and 2017 is on pace to be even hotter than that. And no nation is immune. In the United States, the past decade has been our warmest on record. On our East Coast, the city of Miami now floods at high tide, even in sunny weather. In the West, wildfire season now starts much earlier than it did before and lasts longer. In recent years, our heartland farms were parched by the worst drought in generations, then drenched by the wettest spring in recorded history. We've now seen hurricanes that have left parts of 2 of our 4 largest cities dark and underwater. That's just in the United States. Many nations are dealing with even worse problems, and they begin with a much lower standard of living and less margin for error. And in the midst of all this, global carbon emissions are still on the rise. So the climate is changing faster than our efforts to address it. But the good news is we know what we have to do to avoid irreparable harm. We're going to have to cut carbon pollution in our own countries to prevent the worst effects of climate change. We're going to have to adapt to the impacts that can no longer be avoided. And we will have to work together as a global community to tackle this global threat before it is too late. We cannot condemn our children and their children to a future that is beyond their capacity to repair, especially because we have the technological means and the scientific imagination, if we apply it, to begin to repair the planet now. As one of my friends, the governor in the United States, has said, we're the first generation to feel the impact of climate change, but we're also the last generation that can do something about it. So when I became president of the United States, I took this responsibility seriously. Not only because I was the leader of the world's largest economy and its second largest emitter, but also because I am a father. with 2 daughters. And I expect not too soon that I'll be a grandfather as well. So we have to do something about it. And we immediately began to take steps so that America could take leadership on this issue. In 2009, we worked to salvage what had become a chaotic climate summit in Copenhagen, and we established the principle that all nations have a role to play in combating climate change. At home in the United States, we led by example with historic investments in growing industries like wind and solar that created a steady stream of new jobs. We set the first ever nationwide standards to limit the amount of carbon pollution that power plants could dump into the air that our children breathe. From the cars and trucks that we drive to the homes and businesses in which we live and work, we've changed the way we consume energy. And there were skeptics who said these actions would kill jobs. Instead, we saw the longest streak of job creation in American history. We drove economic output to new highs, and we drove our carbon pollution to its lowest levels in 2 decades. And then we continued to lead by example with our historic joint announcement with China, where we put forward even more ambitious climate targets. And that achievement encouraged dozens of other nations to set more ambitious climate targets as well, all of which paved the way for our success in Paris. That enshrined the principle that no nation can solve this challenge alone, and all of us must solve it together. Now, I will confess that right now we have a different administration in Washington that takes a different approach. But the good news is the United States will hit its targets, despite a different approach by the incoming administration, because so much of what we did is now embedded in our economy and in our culture. Because our states and cities, our universities, our largest companies have made it clear that they will keep pushing forward for the sake of future generations. And at the same time, the rest of the world has pledged to push forward with the Paris Agreement. And that all should give us hope, because that means if we take advantage of this critical time, we have the chance to slow and eventually stop a trend that could be disastrous. Now, the Paris Agreement won't solve the climate crisis on its own. It will help delay or avoid some of the worst consequences of climate change, but even if we meet every target, we won't have gotten to where we need to be. We're still going to need to set bolder targets as technology advances. And if we set bolder targets, then we will open the floodgates for businesses, scientists, engineers to unleash the high-tech, low-carbon investment and innovation that is needed on a scale that we've never seen before. And some of those shifts are already underway. Not just shifts in the amount of clean energy our countries generate and use, that's vitally important, but also shifts in the cost of that energy. In many places, clean energy is not just cost competitive with fossil fuels, it's actually starting to get cheaper than fossil fuels. And it's part of the reason why we have seen, for example, 60% of the new investment in energy generation in the United States, clean energy. We increased solar power by 10-fold during the time I was president, and is continuing to move even faster. 3-fold for wind power. It continues to move even faster. And think about the amazing shifts in the balance of power to consumers, because people are beginning to realize they can take more control over their own energy, how they use it, how much, when. For decades, our energy system basically worked only one way. Utilities generated power, usually from burning dirty fossil fuels. They ran lines to our home and business, we paid for it, and we didn't think about it until we got the bill. But in just a few short years, that's begun to change. A decade ago, smart meters were unusual. Today, we have access to detailed information about how much energy we use, how much we use it, and when. And we can use that information to change our habits, use energy more efficiently, save more money without a lot of sacrifice. We can control thermostats from our smartphones. New appliances, smart devices can tell when energy prices are cheapest and do the laundry or wash the dishes or change or charge our cars during those times. And we have windows and building materials that can actually generate power, not just absorb power. And we can even tell our utility companies that we want our homes powered by renewable energy. Or we can call up a contractor and put solar panels on our roof. And all of that empowers us not only to generate affordable clean energy, but to store it in battery packs or sell it even back to the grid to offset the costs of our own energy usage. That's amazing power that each consumer potentially possesses. And that's the future. That's happening now. And it's an energy revolution that's like revolving from the telegraph to the smartphone in less than a decade. That's how significant this could be, as long as we continue to encourage the kind of investment and innovation that's needed at every level. So governments can set agreements and set targets, but to reach them, all of us have to do our part. We're going to need scientists to design new fuels. We need farmers to grow those biofuels. We need engineers to devise new technologies. And we need entrepreneurs to make and package and sell those technologies. We'll need workers to operate assembly lines that are creating high-tech, zero-carbon components. We need builders to hammer into place the foundations for a new clean energy age. And those of us who are in positions of responsibility need to be less concerned with the judgments of special interests and well-connected donors, and more concerned about the judgment of posterity, the judgment of our children and our grandchildren, who are going to have to live with the consequences of our decisions. And what we're also going to need is citizens who stand up and say, this is important, and compel politicians to act. This is not just the job of politicians. I should point out, it's not surprising that I think that applause started with some young people, because they understand this is not just the job of politicians. We've got to educate our friends and our family and our colleagues. Right now in the United States, we've created 3 million jobs using clean energy. 3 million jobs. There are far more jobs in solar power now in the United States than coal, even though the United States is one of the world's largest coal producers. So we've got to be loud and remind everybody who represents us at every level of government that sheltering future generations against the ravages of climate change, that's what you require if you're going to vote for them. And then we have to vote, of course. So the fight against climate change is not going to give us a clear victory right now. This is going to take decades of work. Our progress will be measured oftentimes by the suffering that was averted and the beauty that we've conserved in places like Argentina. And that makes it hard, because part of what we're purchasing is the ability for our children and grandchildren to enjoy the same things that we enjoy. And our children deserve that. If we can look beyond the daily news cycle and think about the basics, the air that our children breathe, the food they eat, if that is our focus and we're willing to put that above any short-term interests, then it won't be too late. And I'm now 56. I won't see the fruits of all our labor, but we can still act to see that the next century and the century ahead of that is marked not by conflict, not by more suffering, not by more migration, but by cooperation, by human progress, by knowing that we're leaving behind the kind of world that we want for future generations. So thank you very much. I look forward to answering some questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And first of all, thank you so much for taking time off your busy schedule to be with us here today. I know how busy you are, and we're all very honored.
It's fun. I've got to come back to Cordoba and look around some more.
Great. We have a few questions here that I'd like to read to you. Today's event is about training an entire army of 300 women and men that are ready to go out there, knock on doors, and talk to people and bring this message back to their communities. And believe it or not, I was surprised when I first got here to Argentina that a lot of people said that, you know what, civil engagement and talking to people doesn't really work down here. We're different. And I'm wondering, keeping in mind that these people are all very eager to hear from you, as an activist yourself, what is your first message to them?
Well, look, you know, I think when you survey world history, for most of human history, the argument you just made is true. You know, if you were a peasant, if you were a slave, if you were poor, if you were landless, if you weren't part of an aristocracy, then what you said, what you thought, didn't matter. But we were able to create a system of government called democracy, in which, in theory at least, individual voices matter. And so often we give that power away because people don't participate, they're cynical, they don't think folks are listening. And yet, what we've seen time and time again is that when ordinary people come together and mobilize around a vision for change, that can't be stopped. When enough people decided that the Berlin Wall was going to come down, it came down. When enough people determined that South Africa should be governed by majority rule, Mandela walked out of the gate. And in the United States, when Dr. King and a group of young people were willing to confront dogs and fire hoses and men on horseback in order to secure their freedom, we became more free. So I'm a strong believer in people power. And I think on an issue like this, mobilizing public opinion is absolutely critical. Now, it's not easy to sometimes convince people that this should be a high priority because it's invisible. Yeah, the temperature goes up 1 degree one summer. Sometimes people don't mind. They think, this is good. Summer's lasting longer. In fact, there's some who said we shouldn't call it global warming because it sounds nice, warming. Especially if you live in Chicago, where I'm from. But I think that increasingly people are seeing the consequences of inaction in much more concrete ways. And just to give you a couple of examples. In Central America, we saw historic droughts. Part of the reason that there has been a lot of efforts at migration from Central America into the United States, some of it's because of violence, some of it is because of poverty. A lot of it has to do with farmers just could not grow any longer. And has disrupted economies that were already fragile in a profound way. So that's in poor countries. In wealthy countries like the United States, I mentioned earlier Miami, there may be some people here who live in Miami or have condos in Miami or visit Miami. The truth is that if the ocean levels continue to rise, it's very hard to build dams around Miami because the water's coming up through the ground. It's porous. That's the reason why, even on a sunny day, there are parts of Miami now where you'll see a foot of water running down the middle of the street. And everybody looks around trying to figure out, did a water main, did a water pipe burst? But no, that's the ocean. And if you just think about the economic value of Miami and what that might mean if half of it's underwater, it gives you some sense of why it's cheaper for us to take action now than to avoid action in the future. So we have to make sure that people are armed with good information, and then it can't just be left to leaders in government to talk about this, because that's not always how public opinion changes. Most people today are often very skeptical of what politicians say, but if they hear something from their neighbor, they hear something from their friends, if they hear something from their children, because young people tend to be much more conscious about these issues than their parents, then you will start to see a change in attitudes over time that provides the political base for further action.
Thank you very much. And by the way, these questions come from... Simply saying that all the questions come from the 300 leaders, and some of which are young. And this one, and I quote, says, "You know, all the data shows that our younger generation are more aware of climate change and understand its urgency more than the older generations. When it comes to talking to older generations, or even engaging those who don't necessarily agree with our point of view, how can we make a difference and make sure our voices are heard?"
Well, one of the things that people have asked me is, what are you going to do after your presidency? And I will work on climate change as I'll work on a number of issues that are very important to me. But the most important thing that I think I can do is to help to train and support and highlight and connect the next generation of leaders. Because if you look at where we've made the most progress, it typically comes from young people who are pushing against the world as it is to try to achieve the world as it should be. And you know, there are no shortcuts. I think on an issue as complicated as climate change, the first and most critical point is to just get good information. And one of the big arguments, or one of the big difficulties that we're having in the United States, and it may be true in Argentina, and it is certainly true in other parts of the world, is although the internet is providing us more knowledge than ever before, what it's also done is it's divided sources of information for different people. More and more people only watch or listen to or read what they want to hear and what agrees with their existing opinions. And they're now in a position where they can exclude things that don't support what they already think. And so in the United States, if you watch Fox News, you probably don't believe in climate change as much. And that's a problem. So one of the things that I've been suggesting is, before we even argue about what to do about it, we have to at least all agree on a basic baseline of facts. And when it comes to climate change, there's no dispute. I mean, 99.9% of scientists who study this will tell you that the planet is getting warmer. And then there's basic physics that tells you that if the planet gets warmer, then ice melts, for example. You know, you learn this in second grade. And there's a lot of ice in places like Antarctica and Greenland and the North Pole. And as oceans rise and they get warmer, that disrupts weather patterns. And it is more likely to induce more severe storms, more severe hurricanes, wildfires, not only droughts, but also floods, in ways that would have enormous impacts on the lives of people around the world. Now, once we can establish those facts, then we can have an argument about what to do about it. And some people may say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We need to move inland, or move to higher ground, or build more walls to try to keep out the oceans, or what have you, or come up with new technologies. And we can have that argument. I think it's wrong what those who would say we can't do anything about it suggest, but at least we're basing it on the facts. But it takes some time for us to make sure that we get to those facts. And one particular group, because this can't just be the job of politicians, one particular group that I think is really important is the business community. Because businesses have to think in terms of dollars and cents and bottom line. Or not dollars and cents, whatever your currency is. No, I know it's peso cents. One of the reasons that we're still making so much progress in the United States and around the world in reducing carbon emissions is because businesses have figured out this is good for my bottom line. You have big companies like in the United States, Walmart or Google, who've said that part of the way we are going to judge our managers is how much energy are they saving. There was just an announcement that some of you may have heard last week that our two largest automakers, GM and Ford, are going to move to eventually only produce electric cars, because their view is that even if the current U.S. administration is going to try to cancel or lower some of the higher fuel efficiency standards that I imposed, that customers, not only in the United States, but in China and Europe and in Latin America, are going to insist on greater fuel efficiency. So business, I think, has an opportunity to move beyond ideology and say in a very practical way, this is good for business. And once business embraces the need for us to address climate change, then I think it's harder for those who might resist to do the same.
Thank you, Mr. President. When you were first elected in 2008, the United States was still recovering from one of the worst economic crises they had seen in decades. And one of the first and most groundbreaking pieces of legislation passed under your administration was the Recovery Act. This was very important because you were able to put the green economy at the center as a key job creator. Can you tell us how you were able to pass such an ambitious piece of legislation, let's face it, controversial, particularly considering that in the United States, people were anxious about their jobs and perhaps protective about some of the more traditional sectors like oil and gas or even coal?
Well, this is part of the argument that I'll be making over the next several years, is we now have proof that taking a clean energy approach is good for the economy. So let's just take the example of solar in the United States. As I said, we were able, because of providing some initial investments and support and subsidies for consumers to get solar panels on their roofs and to help ventures to increase the number of commercial solar panels that were out there, create rebates so that it was cheaper. We were able to increase solar capacity tenfold. And as you get economies of scale, what ends up happening is that the unit costs of energy production begin to go down. So that now it's often cheaper to produce energy, a watt of energy from solar than it is from those dirty traditional fuels. And what also happens is suddenly new industries come about. So you start having companies training people to install solar panels on houses. And over time, not only did we add 3 million jobs through the creation of this clean energy, but you start getting a virtuous cycle in which more and more people are using it. That's driving down the costs, and a greater and greater percentage of energy use ends up being clean energy. And the reason it's important, I think, for us to recognize that this can be an economic boost and not just a drag on the economy is because if we're going to solve this problem, we're going to have to convince a country like India to be a part of the solution. India was one of the most difficult countries to get to sign the Paris Accords. And I spent a lot of time with Prime Minister Modi of India to convince him that he needed to be a part of this. And the reason he was difficult to convince is not because he didn't believe in the science of climate change, and not because India is not going to be affected by climate change. They have hundreds of millions of people who are affected just by the monsoon season, because that's the traditional way in which all those people feed themselves, small farmers. But the reason it was hard for him to participate was because you have hundreds of millions of people who don't have electricity in the country, and they're very poor. And you can't create a strong coalition to bring about any kind of change if people feel as if their most immediate needs are being sacrificed in some long-term need. So Modi would say to me, he said, look, how can I go to somebody in India who makes $1 a day and tell them you have to wait to get electricity for another 10 years because we're worried about the planet? That person is going to say, no, that may be fine, but I need food right now, or I need electricity right now. And part of the way we were able to convince Prime Minister Modi to get involved is I was able to recruit US businesses to say that they would work with India to meet very ambitious solar standards that would allow both development and support for electrification of poor areas in India, while at the same time meeting their standards for reducing carbon emissions. And the good news is, 2 years later, or a year and a half later, even though a lot of people were skeptical, India's energy generation from solar has exceeded substantially even the ambitious goals that we set, because technology is moving that fast once you start having such high demand from so many people. So I think the more we get proof that this is good for the economy, the harder it becomes for those who would argue that somehow this is going to be bad for the economy.
Thank you very much. Yes, obviously they're going through a
it's not a great
war.
company.
The other one is Nicaragua, and I recently read that the reason why they didn't sign it was because they wanted to send a message saying that it wasn't ambitious enough, and of course the United States. So a lot of our leaders here have been telling us, what does that mean for the world community that the United States is out? Does that mean that things will slow down, or is this a change of direction?
Well, it's not helpful. And I'd prefer that they stay in the Paris Accord and meet the standards, or continue to work aggressively to do what needs to be done. But the good news is, number one, because of some of the steps that I described earlier and the adaptation that's been taking place inside the business community in the United States, we have already reduced the carbon emissions from power plants by 80% of the targets that we had set for the Paris Agreement. So we're going to meet those targets even if the current U.S. administration does nothing, because we launched that ship already. The other reason that I think that you'll see continued progress in the United States, even if in Washington there's not as much help, is because you have already over 300 cities and states and local government who've said that even if the federal government in the United States is not signing the Paris Accords, we are going to meet in our local communities the goals that have been set in the Paris Accord. So when you have a state like California, which would be, if it was a separate country, the 7th largest economy in the world, saying, we're still going to do this, then that makes a huge difference. The same is true, by the way, when it comes to, for example, the car market. You know, if California says we're only going to allow cars that have a certain fuel efficiency standard, even if there's not a federal law, car makers are going to say there's a lot of cars to be sold in California. We don't want to give up that market. And so they'll adjust and adapt their standards in order to make sure that any car they make, they can sell in California, or they can sell in Germany, or they can sell in Argentina, because we now have global markets. So I would prefer strong leadership out of the White House on this issue. The fact that for a certain period of time not be forthcoming, I think does not mean that we can't still move aggressively forward with the goals that we've set.
Thank you. There's a huge disconnect between political elites and the general public. And we all probably need to think about what community means again. So I want to go back to a 20-something-year-old Barak Obama in the inner cities of Chicago when you were a community organizer. And perhaps climate change was not on your radar, but you were engaging and mobilizing poor communities, something that can be mirrored by us, the Green Warriors in Argentina. Can you tell us a few key characteristics that you learned from your time as a community organizer and how you were able to connect to your own communities?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You know, when I was 25, I moved to Chicago and I started working with churches in poor communities where the steel plants there had closed. And people lost jobs. There were racial tensions in some of these communities because people were feeling stressed. And the churches were trying to figure out how can we rebuild community and rebuild trust in those areas. And we weren't completely successful, but I did learn certain principles that carried over into my political life. And I think the most important principle I learned was to listen to people. I think so often with politicians, you know, we try to tell people what to think instead of asking them what are they thinking. And so you know, the first thing I always tell young people if they want to go try to mobilize their communities around an issue or get them active is spend the first month just meeting people and listening to what they have to say. Find out what's important to them, find out what their values are, find out what their relationships are with each other, what are their fears, what are their dreams, what are their hopes for their children. Because if you listen, then two things happen. One is you'll be educated about the community that you're working with. The second thing is people will trust you because they don't think you don't care about them, that you just want to use them for whatever your agenda is. So listening is important. The second thing is, it taught me to trust the power of ordinary people. You know, so often we think that only a professional can solve a complicated problem like climate change or the economy. And it's true that I'm a strong believer in good policy and good technical knowledge and so forth. But what I discovered as President of the United States, it's the same thing that I learned when I was an organizer, is you can have the best plans. You can talk to engineers, and you can talk to economists, and you can talk to social scientists, and you can put together papers and have 10-point development plans and all that. But unless people get behind those plans, they don't mean anything. And so what you have to do then is to trust that if you give power to ordinary people to get involved and to be out front and to speak about their own lives and their own stories, that can end up building the sort of support for whatever your technical plans are, and actually get them implemented because you have a coalition in politics behind it. And it was interesting when I ran for president in 2007, 2008. Some of my opponents, they made fun of, what is this community organizing? This is stupid. This is not professional. And it's true, we didn't have as much money as some people did. We were relying on all these 20-year-olds who had volunteered for the campaign. We would send them out into these communities. They didn't know anybody. They didn't have the support of the political insiders. And we just beat them terribly over and over again. And after a while, they were wondering, well, how come he keeps winning? And it wasn't because we had such a brilliant platform. It was, we trusted those 20-year-olds to go into a town or a community and meet people and talk to people and listen to them and develop relationships. And they were able then to help create a movement. So you'd think after, I used these principles to win the presidency twice, that people would say, we should try that. But sometimes it's still, I think, viewed as somehow just a nice thing to do, as opposed to the way in which you actually can make things happen, bring about change.
Thank you. We have seen translation. We have seen throughout history that big and significant changes come from civil movements. For example, the civil rights movement in the United States was ignored for so many years by important decision makers, but ultimately, key legislation like the Voting Rights Act that would change the game for these activists was finally passed. Looking back on these movements in history, what do you think was the role of civic engagement and entrepreneurship, and how can we apply this as we start to confront climate change?
Well, I've already spoken about why it's so important for ordinary people to get involved and for us to engage people at the local level so that they feel as if they've got a stake in this issue. So if you're talking to farmers, you need to understand the economic pressures that farmers are under if you're going to persuade them to get behind climate change. What is it going to mean for them? Are there ways in which you can make their lives easier or harder? If you're talking to a small business person, they have to feel as if we have a strong environmental approach, that it's not going to mean their business loses money. So we have to engage them. But I should also say this. that's one of the mistakes sometimes activists make, is to think that somehow they can bring change about without ever engaging with the government, right? So, and I see this sometimes with young people, and frankly, sometimes I was like this as well. When I was young and working at a grassroots level, I was suspicious of politicians and mistrustful of the political process, because I thought, this is corrupt and there's money involved, and so I don't want to deal with that. But the truth is that usually the way lasting social change comes about is a combination of activism at the grassroots level, getting people involved, civic engagement, with leadership in politics that's prepared to negotiate and engage and work with those activists to come to arrive at a new social paradigm, a new arrangement. So let's take the example of the civil rights movement. It would not have happened if Dr. King and Rosa Parks and others had not marched and been willing to endure terrible treatment to raise the consciousness of America about the tragedy of segregation. But ultimately, what was also required was Lyndon Johnson being willing to take a tough position and sign the Voting Rights Act, even though he himself was from the South and had been raised to have an attitude that blacks were inferior, but he grew and then was willing to work with the civil rights movement eventually and other members of Congress in order to sign that law. That's not unique to the United States. If you think about what happened in India with Gandhi and the independence movement there. India won its independence because Gandhi helped mobilize people. But what also was true is that you had people like Nehru who were willing to enter into politics eventually and find ways in which to translate a broad vision into practical solutions. And so what's needed, I think, is everyone being willing to engage with each other, a grassroots that mobilize communities, a business community that is thinking about not just their short-term bottom line, but their long-term prospects, and a political class that recognizes their job is to engage and respond to the needs and the hopes of people. And when you get that combination, that's when things really begin to happen. And so my hope is that there are young people who are on the streets getting active and educating people, but also there's some young people who are going into politics. And that way you have people both on the inside and on the outside institutionally who can work together to bring about the changes that need to happen.
And I think you've talked about the work that you will be doing through your foundation, and I was reading about the fact that you plan to also incorporate entrepreneurship and as a key element. What is the role, in your opinion, of entrepreneurs in the development of this new green economy?
Well, it's going to be critical. The truth is that at every stage of technological development and human progress, we've needed brilliant scientists to make discoveries about things like electricity. But then we need engineers to figure out how do you apply that in a way that actually is useful to people. And then you need businesses to figure out how do you take inventions and make them work for mass consumption. And in clean energy right now, we still have work to do. For example, to discover how do we create longer lasting, more effective batteries to store energy that's generated from wind and solar. Because one of the weaknesses that we still have in clean energy is that although producing it can be very cheap, sometimes it's irregular, right? Clouds go over the sky and suddenly, or the wind stops, and then you need still to run your power plant. What do you do? So you have to find ways of storing it. That's an example of areas where we still have a lot of work that has to be done. So we need to put money into research and development, but a lot of that is going to be done not just by government, but by venture capital that's coming in and by entrepreneurs who have identified a potential technology and are willing to take the risk that this might provide us with the breakthroughs that we need. What government can do is set standards that send a signal to the marketplace that if you figure this out, this is going to be worth a lot of money. And what we want to, I think, try to establish, not just in individual countries, but globally, is high standards for clean energy that ultimately will be met because of the ingenuity of engineers and scientists, but also because of the skills of entrepreneurs who are willing to bring that to market. And we have good examples of that. Let's say in the United States, when I was in my 20s, we had a problem of what was called acid rain. Young people probably don't remember this because it's not a problem anymore. But it was at the time. Emissions from power plants, particularly in the northeast of the United States, were sending sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, and the rain that was being produced were killing trees and forests. And essentially, what the first Bush administration, Father Bush did, George H.W. Bush, was to set a standard saying, power plants, you have to bring down your sulfur emissions, but we won't tell you how. We're just telling you you've got to meet this mark by such and such a date. And it turned out that once that benchmark was set, entrepreneurs and businesses got busy, and we eliminated the problem far earlier than the target date. Because once people decided, oh, you know what, there's money to be made in doing this good thing, they figured it out. Innovation and ingenuity gave us the result that we needed. The same will be true across the clean energy space. But part of the problem right now is oftentimes there's not enough incentive for capital to want to get off the sidelines, and entrepreneurs, they're worried, if I take a risk and go into this business, but there's no requirement to make the environment cleaner or to deal with carbon emissions, then I might end up losing everything that I've invested in. So we've got to be able to provide them at least that certainty that if you figure something out, that if you make that bet, it's going to be a big payoff.
Caribbean, the fact that we've seen 2 Category 5 hurricanes in just the last few months or a few weeks. Here in Argentina, people are talking about strong winds and torrential rains and droughts that they had never seen before. Do you see a correlation between climate change and what's happening? Number one. Number two is, if so, how can we as citizens mitigate and adopt to these upcoming changes?
Well, this is a good way for me to end, I guess, hopefully on a positive note. I'll start with the bad news, which is that although we cannot attribute any particular hurricane or drought or other natural event to climate change. We can say with certainty that the kind of storms that we've seen are going to occur much more frequently the warmer the planet gets. It's a matter of physics. Hurricanes are more likely to happen and are going to be more powerful when the oceans get warmer. Torrential rains and flooding, as well as drought, will happen when there's more evaporation, and as a consequence, rain patterns are changed. That we know. So what used to be called a once-in-a-generation flood, or once every 100-year flood, we'll start seeing every 10 years or 5 years. It's just a matter of odds, right? Percentages. So there's no dispute right now that this will be costly, and it will cost us more to do nothing than to do something. That we can say for certain. But I think what I want to leave all of you with is the sense not of despair, but with the sense that, in fact, if we act, we can do something about this. That we don't all have to give up cars or our smartphones or all the technological advances that modern life brings us. That, in fact, we can both grow economically and improve quality of life and help lift people out of poverty, but do it in a smart way. It does require greater effort. It does require greater intention. It does require greater cooperation. It requires greater leadership. My last word to all of you would be just to recognize that each of you, in your own capacity, at different levels, some of you are business people, some of you are academics, some of you are students, some of you are government officials. Everybody has a role to play. And if each of us do our small part, whatever position we're in, then this problem will get solved. We've confronted big issues before. John F. Kennedy once said that there's no problem that man confronts that can also not be solved by man. We created this problem, we can solve it. And as long as each of us takes some responsibility to do that, then I'm confident that our future will be good. All right?
Mr. President, on behalf of the Advanced Leadership Foundation, Cordoba, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bueno, no se vayan, quédense. Bueno, realmente hemos tenido la suerte de escuchar durante mucho tiempo a Barak Obama con las preguntas de Juan Verde.